time. It's our time, my friends. Time for millions of maturepreneurs, 55 plus, who are hashtag not done by a long shot, to revolutionize how we lead, do business, and innovate our world. I'm your host, Jeanette Anderson, and welcome to my conversations with fascinating people who would rather inspire than retire. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Maturepreneur podcast, where we have those who are too inspired to retire and who support them in being too inspiring to be retiring. So today I have with me Dr. Melissa Robinson-Winemiller, who's coming to us from, where did you say you were?
Kansas City.
Kansas City. That's what I thought, where it's very hot and sweaty there right now. So welcome, Melissa. I'm glad to have you here.
Oh, I'm excited to be here, Jeanette. Thanks so much. You and your audience are fantastic.
I agree wholeheartedly. They are an awesome audience. So today we're going to be talking about the courage to connect, empathy, EQ, and the evolution of leadership. Because whether you are coming out of entrepreneurship or employment into entrepreneurship, whether you are growing your business, you've been in business for quite a while, and you're keeping going, no matter what stage you're at, as a business owner, as a leader in the community, in whatever capacity, we need more emotional intelligence, EQ, and to evolve as leaders in order to move ourselves, our businesses, and our world forward. So that's our topic today. It's just a nice light conversation about, evolving leadership as we know it. So, and this is a big passion of Dr. Melissa, so I'm going to tell you the official intro, then we'll find out all the juicy tidbits behind the scenes. So, after losing her career as a professor to brutally unempathetic leadership, Dr. Melissa Robinson-Winemiller reinvented herself as an expert in empathy and EQ and has never looked back. Not only does she have 30 plus years of leadership experience in profit, nonprofit, and academic settings, but also a doctorate in interdisciplinary leadership and experience consulting in change management, data analytics, and the psychology of work. That's a lot. Add to this decades as an author, coach, and public speaker, and she's created the perfect blend to guide both current and emerging leaders in navigating those murky waters to increase productivity, innovation, and profit. Ooh, I love it. All right. So you must have got started early in terms of your academic career to be a professor so young. Did you like go right into academia in your life, or how did you end up there so quickly? We'll get to the other stuff in just a second, but I'm just curious because that's a whole lot of academic progress in a short time.
It is, but I actually didn't. I was a working performing musician, gigging musician for quite a while before I actually went into academia. And the reason I did it is just as a gigging musician, you don't have things like benefits. Yeah. It's not in this country. So, yeah, exactly. So I got my doctorate. Sorry, go again.
I was going to say that's fascinating. So you went from being a gigging musician to getting your doctorate. That's a fairly significant leap. It's not like you just went back to school to get a trade or something. Was that your intention when you went in?
Not really. I mean, I'd already gotten my master's, so I really was very happy performing. That's all I wanted to do. But you get a little bit older and you get a little bit wiser, and you start to see that some of the stuff that you didn't think you needed when you were younger might be a good idea.
Like benefits and security and so forth. Yeah. Yes. All right. Well, so that's the official intro, which is very impressive. Tell us something about you no one would guess from reading your website or listening to this. And you can't use gigging musician because you already said that. So yes, something that people would never guess about you, maybe even your friends don't know.
That I actually am a pretty good cook and baker. I bake bread almost every single week, and I've gotten really good at Bavarian cream and doing a Boston cream pie.
Wow. So, that's very cool. Your family must be really thrilled about that hobby. That hobby.
They are, actually. That's why I just got back from visiting my dad. He's like, well, can you bring bread and cookies? And I'm like, yes, I can bring bread and cookies.
That's Awesome. All right. So you tell us a little bit about your why, your purpose. What kind of led you to this path, but also to the work you're doing now? So what would you say is your overarching purpose in life?
The one thread that really goes through it all is that I really just have this need to be able to, I don't, it's more than just help, but enrich other people. Like, even as a musician, I mean, it's not something that's a live or die sort of thing, but it's something that really enriches other people and the culture and the being able to connect with this kind of thing. And I was a personal trainer and a fitness person for a while, and same thing. I wanted to help, but at the same time, I wanted to really be able to enrich lives and make them better and, be able to get people to do more and be better than they thought they could ever be on their own. And
Mm,
that's very much what's brought me into this stage of my life as well, because I see not just the problems that this causes for younger generations, but the problems that people without empathy and emotional intelligence cause for themselves. Because a lot of times they're very confused as to why this is going on. They
yeah,
truly don't get it a lot.
yeah.
So that's my goal. If I can leave any life I touch better when I leave than when I walked in, then I've done what I want to do.
That's awesome. And this may seem counterintuitive, but why is that so important to you? Because it's one thing, because lots of people say I'd love to help people, and we just kind of assume, okay, that's the end of the story. But why does that matter to you? What does that do for you?
Oh, I mean, on one hand, I feel like I'm leaving the earth a better place. It's that web of interconnection. Everybody I touch touches someone else, touches someone else, and that's really important to me. I grew up as a military brat, so we moved every 2 years, and because of that, I always felt kind of isolated and just sort of alone. Because I mean, we'd move from like New Orleans to Washington State to Kansas to whatever, and so I missed that interconnectedness. So now I find that that really drives me to help create not just an interconnectedness, but a positive interconnectedness.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. My contention is that our why is often what we have are healing from the past and what we long for the future, for ourselves and others. And so I hear the longing for connection and kind of a consistency of that connection, which makes a lot of sense because it was intermittent at best and broken quite often, the connections with, friends when you move, that kind of thing. So staying connected and having that be a really positive, rich experience makes a lot of sense. So you've got quite a background. So a physical trainer, a professor, a gigging musician. What are some of the other jobs you've done?
Oh man. Well, the thing is as a gigging musician, you almost always have some kind of byline. There's always something else going on. So I did office clerical type work at universities and at hospitals. I've done volunteer work, especially with like animals, animal shelters, that kind of thing. Even with the personal trainer thing, at one point I had, because like 70% of performing musicians end up with career ending injuries because of how they practice and how they sit and what they do with their bodies. So that was supposed to eventually move into the music side of things as well. I had really wanted to be able to work with musicians and kinesthetically, how can you hold your instrument? How can you sit? What can you do for training, especially as you get older? Bodies break down.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I've kind of had my fingers in. I've done healthcare consulting with my husband. I,
Wow.
I I'm kind of all over the place.
Well, I just call that being a Renaissance person.
Yes.
I didn't know that about musicians, that there was such a high, impact, physical impact, that you wouldn't think of that unless you were a musician and practicing a lot, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, that's probably an area that doesn't get a lot of attention, support, and so forth. And even if there is, it may or may not be the thing that they invest their money in. So that's yeah,
Yeah.
interesting and probably very challenging area to build a business in, but much needed. That's one of the challenges. So when you went into your kind of academic career, what did you study and why? What called you to that? So what did you get your first degree in?
So my first doctorate was in music performance and education because I was a French hornist. So that's like what I did. I was a French hornist. I was a French horn professor. I taught students, like if you're talking to band directors, I would teach an entire class, how to teach French horn, that sort of thing. But I also did theory. I also did a little bit of music history along the way. And I did a lot of conducting.
Wow.
So, which I loved, because you got to, there you are, you're leading this group, and how this group does and how you interact with these students and what they do really hinges on how good you are as a leader.
Mhm.
So, you
That's
know,
very cool. And, on that note, I've always been curious, because to me, and I don't mean this in any way as a slight, but as an audience member, I look and I think, do they really need the conductor? Like, other than to get them started, is it because the pace of the song is the pace of the song, right? And
yeah.
so how significant is it to have a conductor versus not have a conductor when they've got the music and etc. Like, that's always seemed to me to be kind of an odd thing.
That's actually a fantastic question, because that's one of those analogies that I use when I'm talking about leaders a lot, in
Okay.
that the leader, the group may not necessarily need them. And when you're talking a super high level group of musicians, especially one that's probably played the music a lot of times, they really don't. The conductor should be there to enhance the music, to be able to bring synergy in places where maybe it wasn't there before, or just to be able to hear and say, yeah, this team and this team aren't working as well together. Let's listen across and see what we can do to bring this together.
Mm,
And some pieces, like if you're talking like marches or things that have a really steady rhythm, you probably don't need a conductor at all.
mm.
But if you have a really good conductor, they can pull more out of the musicians than the musicians knew they were capable of themselves. And that's the difference between an adequate leader and a good leader.
Very good analogy and segue there. So, you had a bad leader that was a bad experience for you. Is that where your interest in leadership started, or was it always something that had been of interest for you?
It had always been an interest to me, just because, going through all the different fields I'd been through, and seeing all the different people in all sorts of different places, so you couldn't say, well, this just happens in this town, in this place. I saw a lot of really mediocre leaders, but then I also saw ones at either end of the spectrum. And thinking back, I can only think of one or two that were really good, but I can think of a handful that were really bad and destructive. And it was just like, how did you get there? And who let you stay? Why are you there? So it was always an interest to me, because I couldn't understand how people could be in that position and not be more sensitive to what was happening around them, to the point that it was okay to just kind of bulldoze through things.
Right. And so it must be very interesting for you watching politics in your country.
Yeah.
So where did the whole kind of fascination with EQ and empathy as a highlight part of leadership come in? Because obviously it's significant. And was that always the focus, or was it when you really saw the lack of it that it became more of a focus?
It's actually always kind of been a focus for me, for whatever reason. I think because of having to move schools every 2 years, I was very in tune with what was going around me with people. Because kids are not always very nice to new kids that come into the school, because they look different, they talk different, they act different. So I was just like super aware of interactions, because you wanted to stay out of the way, basically. But then as I got older and I saw some of these horrible leaders and that lack of interaction, there was a huge disconnect for me, because I just didn't understand them. But the real nail in the coffin, I guess, was when I had this horrible leader that I had an assault, and this person basically said that they didn't really care what happened to me, that if I was making trouble as a junior female faculty member, I might as well kiss my academic career goodbye. And it was a miserable thing to have to deal with. But the thing that really got me was that in going up through the system, this academic system, I couldn't get anybody to listen. Nobody wanted to hear about it. And I just could not understand where this disconnect was, because these were good people. These weren't bad people. These,
Yeah.
these weren't, they weren't malicious, but for some reason, it was just like we were talking two different languages. And then by the time I left, I was just very confused by the whole thing, and just was left going, I don't understand. I talked to basically everybody that I could talk to, and there was nothing. They're okay with their system running this way. They're okay being in this kind of environment. This isn't okay. Where was the disconnect? And that's when I started trying to put it all together.
Well, I think that's a really valuable question that you asked, because there's a lot of people who have things happen and they just get fixated on the what happened, as opposed to where was the disconnect, where was the breakdown, what happened in terms of what was the systemic situation or whatever, to really get curious about looking beyond the immediate impact to what might have been behind that. So what did you decide about that, or what did you discover in terms of that particular environment or that particular culture? What did lead
Well,
to?
when you're in a culture where people are constantly reactive because of, in my opinion, because of the culture, because people are constantly sniping, they're always looking out for their job, they're always, there's enough leaders that are completely toxic as to be kind of around all the time. You're constantly in a reactive mode, you're constantly trying to defend. And unfortunately, when that happens, these people as a whole systemically kind of get into this, well, if they're doing it to her, they're not doing it to me kind
Right,
of thing. And you end up sort of scapegoated. And
right.
that's definitely what happened within my department, because as long as the focus was on me, there were
Yeah,
a lot of other people that went under the radar that I've heard that since maybe haven't been going under the radar as much.
right. Okay.
So,
Yeah, there's all sorts of different kind of dynamics in political environments that, and almost every human gathering becomes a political environment, or there's all sorts of different dynamics. But
yeah.
let's start with some of the basics. So, what is EQ, and what's the difference between EQ and empathy? Or define both EQ and empathy for us.
Yeah. So EQ is just short for emotional intelligence. If IQ is brain smarts, then EQ is heart smarts. And basically, what it is that I can understand and control my emotions, and I can understand the emotions of others. So I like to think of it kind of like a big tool bag. And in this tool bag are all sorts of soft skills that comprise emotional intelligence, whether it's communication or teamwork or motivation or all of these different things.
Mhm.
Empathy, on the other hand, is when I can feel what someone else is feeling because I can understand where they're at. I may not have had that particular situation, and I'm not taking responsibility for it. I'm not trying to fix it. I just understand. Brene Brown calls it being in the suck together. And that's very much what it is. It's just kind of an understanding of where they're at. So the way I teach it, if I'm having empathy for someone and I can kind of understand where they're at, then I can reach into my emotional intelligence tool bag. And I know if I need to pull out a hammer or a saw, and I can be more effective that way because I'm not just, searching around and trying to do what I read in Forbes this week, which would be a good emotional intelligence thing to do.
Right. Okay. Well, let's just a little bit more refine empathy, because there's a difference between understanding what they're feeling and feeling what they're feeling. Because I think a lot of people take on other people's emotions and call that empathy. Is that what you mean? Or do you mean that we just get it, but we don't necessarily take it on, or have that experience?
Well, it's kind of both. When they started in the research, there was actually 42 different kinds of empathy, and they managed to distill it down to 8. So what you're talking about are two different kinds of empathy. The cognitive kind is cognitive empathy. I understand what's going on, and I know what you're feeling logically. The other kind of empathy is called affective or emotional empathy. Now, the thing is I might feel it, but that doesn't mean I have to take it on. And there is a line to be drawn there, which is something I do work with leaders with, because they can't take on that emotion from everybody. So I can feel it, but I'm not going to absorb it. I'm not taking responsibility. I'm just understanding it. And I've actually found it works best when both work in tandem, because
Yeah.
then you can keep a cool head and a warm heart.
Right. That's a good combo. I like that. Cool head and warm heart.
Yeah.
Very good. I like that. It should be a bumper sticker. Okay. So, you contend that these skills, EQ and empathy, are actionable, skill-based, action-oriented, things that leaders can develop and get better at. Because I think a lot of people might think that really good leaders are born, not made. So what would you say about that?
I would say that the idea that leaders are born and not made actually went out the door in about the 50s or 60s, which is why we have so many programs that are supposed to train leaders. And I do believe leadership skills are trainable if you want to learn. There's always that caveat that you have to be willing to learn, which means you first have to be willing to accept that you don't know something.
Right.
But I do believe that empathy and EQ are the same. Now, when you think about empathy, statistically speaking, 95 to 98% of the population has it. There is some biological basis in this. Even newborn babies, like if one starts crying, a room of them will start crying through emotional contagion. So there's very early, like proto empathy behaviors that happen. So, because much of our population has it to some degree on a spectrum, some have more than others, some are more talented than others, but we have it. It's not necessarily a matter of learning it, it's a matter of learning how to practice it.
Mm,
So now we're talking a skill. You've got this, you've got to practice it and refine it and get better at it. And emotional intelligence is exactly the same. You can most people have a certain amount of raw talent in these areas, even leaders, but they get barraged with all sorts of different advices and different things and different stuff. And they take, 18 personality tests and they're told, yes, you have EQ. Well, that's great. You have it, but you have to use it.
mm.
I kind of talk about that like being a treadmill. I'm not that person, I swear, but we've all known people that have a treadmill or some exercise equipment in the corner of their bedroom, right? And they hang clothes on it, or
Yeah.
the cat sleeps on it.
Yes.
So they have a treadmill, but they don't use that treadmill. So you can't get the outcomes from it. And the only way to use it is to get on there and get skilled at using it.
Right.
It's the same with empathy and emotional intelligence. You've got to get on it, you've got to get skilled at using it.
So what would that look like in terms of leadership? Like how would I know that someone has good emotional intelligence skills? What would that look like?
Yeah. So one of the best ways to really dig in on this and understand what's going on interpersonally is to start with the self. And I talk about charity starts at home. So it starts with this idea of self-reflection and understanding what's going on with you. Because what I've found in a lot of leaders is that they're very driven, they're very ambitious. If you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they're very high self-actualizing people, but they don't take time to show themselves empathy.
Mm,
And it sounds counterintuitive because with empathy, I'm saying I understand your emotions, but they don't take time to understand their own emotions, which is why you end up with so many leaders with family problems, with substance abuse, with really unhealthy habits, because they haven't taken the time to actually understand what it means for them. So that's the first place to start. What does this mean for me? How do I show this to me? How do I understand what this is? Then once you start to get a handle on what it is, you can start to pick it out in other people because you've got the right vision for what's going on with it. The other thing I talk about with this is that it's not a leadership in 4 easy steps kind of thing, or one weekend fantastic leadership plus 2 tests. It's a practice. It's not a performance. So it's one of those things you spend a little bit of time on every single day, probably forever.
mm.
But the gains that you get from this, both professionally and personally, is worth that little bit of work and that daily grind to be able to get to know yourself better and get to know other people better through that.
So one of the things human beings, we can be fairly self-delusional, like if you ask people, everybody thinks they're funny, everybody thinks they're a great lover, and then everybody thinks they're a great leader.
Yep.
How do we actually know where we are and where those strengths and those weaknesses are? What's some good ways to get some objective perspective on our leadership capability?
First and foremost is to find somebody to objectively tell you. And that could be having a mentor. That could be just having someone that's accountability buddy. That could be hiring a coach. And in that case, I really stress make sure you hire a good coach. Make sure you hire a coach that's a good fit for you because you're going to want someone who's going to be able to look at everything objectively and say, I appreciate that you were trying to be direct with your employee when they were in here, but you could have maybe handled it better when I watched them like melt into their chair, or I know in the meeting you were very driven on all the statistics on the board, but you didn't notice what was going on in the room and that you had lost all of your people. You've got to have somebody there to tell you the truth. And of course, the next question that comes up is always, well, do I have to have another person? Can I do it myself? You can, if you can be honest with yourself. You can journal, you can write things down, you can videotape yourself, you can think about these things, but you're going to have to be honest, which
Right.
means you're going to have to be honest that, as you said, you are a human being and you're going to have human being flaws, and you're probably going to think maybe things are going better than they are.
Well, and I think probably one of the best ways to help with the objectivity is, rather than saying, am I right, say, did it work? Was this
Yes.
effective? Did I get the results that I was going for or not? Because we can get pretty positioned about our positions, whatever they may be,
Yeah.
and think, well, no, I was right to be driven and direct and da 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 da, because that's what I would want, because usually we are what we think we want. And that's the right way to be. But is it working? Is it effective? Are you getting the results that you want? So that's one way, is to get some objective feedback. You mentioned earlier there's lots and lots of tests that you can take.
Mhm.
um, what are the ones that you would recommend? Because I know there's lots out there and there are different ones for different purposes, but if people wanted to get a sense of where they're at in terms of their EQ, are there any particular tests or types of personality systems that you prefer?
I actually do not. And here's why. Because there's 8 different kinds of empathy and a whole bunch of skills that all go together in EQ. So what I've found with these tests is that, number one, everyone is different. So as everyone is approaching these tests, it's just like, well, what's the definition of empathy? Well, there's this many definitions of empathy. Well, I'm taking this test. I don't necessarily know that. So the test may give me good feedback based on what I put into it, or it may not be completely clear. So it has a lot to do with making sure you're taking something that's good, that's going to have a human being there, that's going to help suss this out, that's going to be able to break it down, that's really understanding what was going on. The
Yeah.
other thing is the research I've done shows that most people have this. So again, I don't really need someone to tell me I have empathy or EQ. I need someone to be able to say, this is how you make it actionable.
Mm.
Because sitting in a room and having it just isn't going to do anybody any good.
That, okay. So what are some of those ways to make it more actionable?
First of all, starting with the self-reflection, being able to understand what's going on with you. The next step is to actually be able to relate to your people. So that's going to mean actually getting out and being with your people. A lot of leaders cloister themselves off and they're very busy. I'm not going to negate that. But would you mind if I went through a case study that I've done with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I have this director and he's been doing great work, but he was walking into this job and he was told, look, the culture is a problem. This is what we need you to do. He's walking in as an outsider. He has no idea what to do. We figure out what I want him to do is to be able to, we call it making the rounds. He touches his people every single day. Now he's a busy guy. It's not like he has a ton of time to, talk about the fish. He walks through the offices and stuff his people are in. He's like, hey, how you doing? How you doing, Corey? What's happening with the wife? What's happening here? And he's touching his people every single day. And I mean, as a bonus, he gets to get up from his computer for 10 minutes and actually go for a walk, which means he's more effective when he's in his office being a leader.
Right.
So now by actually touching his people every single day, he started to build his know, like, and trust factor. They know who he is. They start to like him. Hopefully, that's the goal. And because of that, they start to trust. Now, because of this, some of the people who were boots on the ground actually went to him and said, look, there's this stuff going on that's causing these inefficiencies. We think we know a way to change it because we see it every day. What do you think? This is what's happening on this clinic because of these supply things. We've got a better idea to do this. So now the innovation is going up because they're trusting him enough to come to him and say, look, we can do these things differently. And he, as the leader, spearheaded it to be able to get these things taken care of as much as he could, which then led to better productivity. Well, now his employee satisfaction scores have gone up because things are working better. The machine is ticking along like it should be. The culture is better because everybody likes each other. And because all of this has happened, his Press Ganey scores went up. And now we're talking profit.
Mm. Okay.
So It all goes together. And it just started with reaching out and touching his people so they felt like people. All he had to do was get out of his office.
Right. Okay. So, what are some other ways that make things actionable in terms of upping our skills?
Listening and communication. So the
Okay.
fact that he was listening to his people when they're like, look, we have a different way of doing this. This isn't necessarily how it's been done, but we think that we can do this better. He was an active listener to what they were saying. He wasn't just saying, yeah, this is how we've always done it. So this is how we're always going to do it. That sort of thing. The United States as a nation, we waste $1.2 trillion every year on bad communication. But that's an example of what can happen when you have good communication. And it affected the big three: profitability, productivity, and innovation. Active listening, being willing to talk with his people, and not just being so set on this is how we've always done it.
Right.
Another thing that I see in leadership a lot is that people get into leadership positions because they've always done something in a certain way. This has always worked.
Mhm.
So they're very scared of walking away from that and going, oh, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know how well this is going to work. But being courageous to be able to take that plunge and say, my people who are boots on the ground are telling me that this might be a better way to go, which then goes into the idea of the leaders as the strong, infallible, I can do anything sort of person, as opposed to a humble leader who can say, yeah, you might have an idea that hadn't crossed my mind. And I'm strong enough to understand it doesn't make me look weak to be able to listen.
Yes. So let's shift just a little bit to people who are perhaps maturepreneurs who are reinventing themselves, or people who are going through a reinvention process at any point in life, but who are uh, writing their next chapter, perhaps not sure what that might look like, dealing with some of the fears, concerns on how to make the leap. What does it look like? Will I be, accepted? I'm going into an area of conscious incompetence. How do I do that? What are some of the, besides, which I think is a really valuable one that you said earlier, listen and be empathetic with our own feelings? Are there leadership skills that can help people through those kinds of difficult stages? What are some of the things that a good self leader and leader in that situation would do?
Yeah, absolutely. Because even though it sounds like what I did was a straight line, it was not a straight line. So, I kind of came around to this in my late 40s, early 50s too. And I had to be able to move into that. I have no idea what I'm doing. Now what do I do? I've been a musician, and this is what I've done. Now what happens? So the first thing I really had to figure out was to actually show myself empathy. And I don't mean that to sound trite, but I was beating myself up about how could I lose this? What did I do? What went wrong? What should I have done different? And to be able to accept that, it happened. There was a whole bunch of things. Most of it was out of my control. And even the things I could control, I was doing the best I could with what I had at the time. So now let me just, show myself the same mercy I would show somebody else and move forward so I can think clearly. Because that was part of it. I was so bound up in everything that had happened. I had a hard time thinking clearly.
Yes.
And other people like us that have made this transition later on, I hear that too, that, well, what, this is what I've done. This is who I am. I
Mhm.
had to be able to get away from that as well. It isn't who I was, it's what I did.
Yes.
Well, I can do something else now.
Right. Yeah, I think that self-identification is a really significant part of it. To unhook the what I do and what I am
Yeah.
is not easy, especially if somebody's been doing it for a very long time, or like in your case, has invested tons of education and time and specialization in an arena to let that go per se. But I mean, we never let it go. It's part of us forever.
Yeah.
But it feels like a loss, feels like letting it go at times, can be really challenging to say, okay, if I'm not that, then what am I? Right?
Yeah.
If I'm not doing that, then who am I? Because that's where we identify with, is the what we do as opposed to who we are as a being. And so in terms of your journey, what got you to make that leap? What was the thing that allowed you to come up with the courage to go out on your own in this new business?
I just couldn't live the way I had been living anymore. I hit a point where I knew it was either that I was going to have to make a break and do something radical, meaning just something I had never done before, and I was just going to have to take a leap of faith, or I was just going to devolve into just nothing. And I understand it isn't quite that dramatical.
Yeah.
But that's what I felt. I felt like I had lost everything and everyone, and there was just nothing left. So when you're at rock bottom, there's nowhere to go but up. And if I'm being very, very honest, I mean, there was a certain amount of alcohol involved, and there was a lot of self-loathing, and there was a lot of anger.
Mhm.
So I knew that either I was going to keep going down that hole and I was going to reach a point I couldn't crawl back out again, or I was going to have to do something. And I had no idea what to do. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to get an MBA. And that's not, necessarily what anyone else would have to do. It's just, it was the lifeline that I grabbed onto. And that's where I started getting into some of these leadership classes and beginning to think through some of the empathy and EQ things that then led me out.
Right.
But there really was a do or die point where who I had always been was pretty much dead. And I was going to have to figure out if I was going to crawl out or not.
Right. Well, and thank you for that honesty, because I think a lot of people, we bring ourselves to that crisis point because we are so enmeshed in who we've been, what we've been, that we don't want to let go of it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it no longer fits. And that creates a whole crisis. And how we deal with crisis is often not the probably most productive or helpful way, but it's how we deal with it, because it's what we need to do to get through at that time, whether it's, addictions or drinking or distraction or food or sex or whatever it may be. Human beings are prone to do that. And so really the strength is recognizing it, making a conscious choice, and probably making that choice a number of times, because we often decide, and fundamentally we have to decide to change directions, but then we have to continue to re-choose and re-choose and re-choose, or at least that's my experience. So
Yeah.
when you did say, okay, that's enough, I've reached what I'm going to consider my bottom, what was your kind of way out from there so that you could get into this business that you're in now? Because it wasn't just a decide and the next day you're there. So what was that
No,
journey?
I knew I was going to have to make some kind of shift. And if I'm being very honest about this, because I had been a musician most of my life, musicians are kind of looked down on in the academic world,
Mhm.
right? Because we're the dumb bunnies that go out and play on the stage, and we're just that's what, even though that's not the case at all,
Yeah.
that's very much how we're treated in the hierarchy because it's not hard sciences, it's not math. And I had always wondered if I might have been capable of more intellectually if I'd ever, given myself the chance. I mean, part of the reason I went into music is I had scholarships. I came from a family that didn't have money. So I took the path that allowed me to move on, you
Yeah.
know. Whereas if I were doing math or hard science, that probably wouldn't have happened.
Right.
So it was like, okay, so what have I done in the past that I've always wondered if I could do? What is the thing that I've always felt kind of held back on? And it was like, well, I never really dug in on the statistics. I never really dug in on the sciences. Well, the way I had seen myself at that point, I'm like, well, I'm already a complete failure. So what am I going to do? Fail more? Well, all right, let's take a leap and see what happens. And so that's what I did. And I'm really glad that I did. It was a chance, but
And so for you, again, thank you for the honesty, because I think these kinds of honest conversations lets people know that they're not alone, that it is eminently human, and that it is, especially if you've lived a while, we've all gone through the shit in some way, shape, or form. And to just say it is to bring it out of the shadows and say, this is part of being human. And especially this stage can be really challenging because of that loss of identity. Most of our life, we're scrambling to live into the identity. Now we're kind of scrambling to get out of it, which is different for most people. So you decided to go back and get some education that was kind of a safety zone for you, or a zone to go and get some structure and have support and develop some expertise. And then what? How did you go from that to now being an entrepreneur?
Well, during that time and a little bit before, I'd already been doing some consulting with my husband, and he's been in medicine like his whole life. So he knows the system very well. Whereas I was very much the background. I was the one doing the HR stuff. I was the one doing the data analytics. I was the one doing the grit work while he was out there, shaking his moneymaker. So I the farther I got, because I was also working kind of a secretarial job at the same time for the benefits. I mean, maybe that's my life's thread. I don't know. I'm always looking for benefits. But but it was kind of like I got into the MBA, and the farther I got into the business and the leadership, I started talking to this professor who was a statistics guy, and he was like, "You really need to dig into these statistics more. You actually have a really good hold on them," which was something I never thought I would hear in my life.
Yeah.
So it was like, okay. So I went on and got the second master's of science of data analytics, so that I could end up crunching this stuff for these surgery centers and pain clinics we were working with. But then from there, it was like, okay, so this is nice. We're doing fine, but there's more to this. There's just more to it, especially with the leadership classes I had had and the people I had talked to. And of course, when you start focusing on something, then suddenly you're seeing it all around you. And I ended up going, okay, I'm going to go get a second doctorate, which is kind of crazy, but I'm going to do it. So, I just kind of kept following the path, which I think, again, for those of us that do these things a little later in life, it's kind of like everything goes up in the air and there's no path. So you're like, well, now what do I do? There's just this big pile of rubble. I have no idea what to come out of this. But the more I kept kind of pushing, the more these paths would kind of open themselves up, and it'd be like, well, what about this? Well, this fits, the data analytics actually fit right into leadership when you start looking and figuring out leading indicators and lagging indicators, and that this, the soft skills really do equate to hard numbers and that sort of thing. So, that's what I mean. It sounds like it was a straight path in hindsight,
Yes. Yes.
but moving forward, it was kind of, do you remember Pigpen from Charlie Brown?
Yeah.
How he was always in a cloud? That
Yeah.
was kind of it.
Yeah. And I think that there's some real beauty in, again, representing that and saying that, because there's a lot of times when we're in various stages of the not knowing that we do feel like we're in that cloud.
Yeah.
And if we're smart, we do what it did, which was keep taking a step and take a step, and in the action there becomes clarification. In the action you can start to see where pieces can fit together. In the moving forward, whether it's quote unquote the right direction or not, even if we're not sure, we get more of a sense of what direction we want to go in. And so that ultimately kind of solidified for you into leadership consulting, speaking on the topic, and working with people. How do you work with people now? What's your business?
So I am an author, and the writing's a big part of it, because I feel like, the more I write, the more I can reach, and the more I can reach, the more I can write. So I have a book coming out in September, which I'm very excited about. I'm also doing some speaking, because same thing. If I just sit in my room and talk to my cats about it, then I'm not really doing any good in the world. I want to be out there and talking. But then I also consider myself a trainer. And I might be training one person, I might be training small groups, but because this is a skill, I'm training people how to use it. So I actually don't really like the word coach so much. I want to be a trainer. I want to be in it up to my elbows along with them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's kind of where I'm at.
Up to my elbows with them. So speaking of resources and how people can find out more, you have a YouTube channel, right? What kind of content do you put on there? It's called the period, at the period empathetic period leader. So the period empathetic period leader. So what kind of content can people find there?
That's where I work on all of my ideas surrounding empathy and EQ, because no one has put this together in this way before. they always lump empathy in with emotional intelligence. And I actually think it's a precursor. So that channel gives me a chance to be able to flesh these ideas out and talk about them and research them and do it in bite-sized nuggets. And also if someone is a leader and they're like, oh, well, this one's on lawyers and empathy, let's look at that, or this one is talking about courage and empathy, let's look at that. It gives them just little bite-sized nuggets to be able to listen to some of this.
Awesome. And you also have a gift for people, the top 5 traits that leaders need now. So where can they get that? And what is that?
That is a video that talks about the top 5 traits that leaders can integrate into their leadership right now, as opposed to being something that takes a lot of time to learn or a lot of time to practice, and they can start integrating and start using. And you can get that at my website, which is EQ VIA empathy. And I call it that because it's just a lot shorter than saying EQ through the use of empathy. So
Yeah.
that's why it's,
Really onerous URL. So
yes,
eqviaempathy.com. And
yes.
the video that you're going there to look for is the top 5 traits that leaders need now. And I'm assuming it's like a mini training on those 5 traits, gives them an idea of how to incorporate some of those.
Yes, it's very short, very bite-sized.
Okay, well, just because we want to tease them, what are the 5 traits so that they'll go and learn how to do those?
Well, I talk a little bit about self-reflection because
Yep,
I'm really big on that because it's a thing that people are missing. I talk about communication,
yep,
self-motivation,
yep,
being able to understand and relate to your team, that kind of synergistic teamwork,
yep.
and then being able to use empathy to be able to pull all of this together
Mm.
with your people and make your team better than they thought they could be.
Cool. All right. And if you're listening to this and thinking, well, I'm an entrepreneur and I only have one VA or whatever, so it's not really applicable, I would challenge you to say that's the perfect time to A, practice. B, you're a leader, even if you're in a room by yourself, if you actually lead yourself effectively. But we all are more in a leadership position by virtue of being an example. We're always being an example to someone, somewhere.
Yeah.
And that is leadership in action, right? So I know situations. Oh, sorry, got a cough. You talk about that for a second.
Well, I think that's absolutely true because in leading yourself, you actions speak so much louder than words as a leader. One example that I could give of that is a leader, a high level leader that I recently saw. She another one that's always into this reactive stuff. She ended up just canceling a morning meeting at the last minute, and she didn't think about it. And it was because she wanted to be there for her kid's first day of school. Makes perfect sense, right? Except for that, she didn't have the empathy to consider that so did everybody else in this room. Also was the first day of school for their kids, and they didn't get to just not go to the meeting. There were people that had been working overnight that were coming into that meeting because it was the one that they had, and she canceled at the last minute. So now all 60 of these people are spread out to 3 different other meetings, which means now they've spread out whatever dissatisfaction they have. And it wasn't because she was evil, it's because she didn't stop and think about it. So her actions spoke much louder than her words. And I had to actually be able to say, you need to step back and look at this through different eyes because in leading yourself, your actions maybe didn't portray the kind of leader that you would like to be seen as.
Exactly. And, a lot of times it's just, do we want to be the recipient of that kind of behavior? When people chronically show up late, it's like, do you like that when they do that to you? No, don't do it to other people, that kind of logic, but sometimes it's not always logical.
Yeah.
And I think, I've been seeing lots of speakers who are one way up on stage. And then when you talk to them off stage, that's not who they are. And
Oh,
the ones that get me the most are the ones who talk about being in integrity and being congruent and stuff like that on stage, and then get off and are completely uncongruent or incongruent with
oh.
what they were just espousing. So it matters. It matters if you're going through an airport. This happened to me. I was going through an airport and something happened. I had an exchange with someone. I've had this happen both ways. With a service provider, and it got seen by someone that I was then at a conference with. In one case, I was not kind. In the other case, I was kind. Both times it got back to me. Both times that person saw me later and went, oh, so that's who you really are. And we had conversations around it. So we are always on display being leaders, even if we don't think we are. And we need to be conscious of that, especially if you're in business, in the public eye in any way, shape, or form. There's so many things that we could talk about that are so great. I love your authenticity. I love your passion for this topic. What's one tip you'd like to leave everyone with? Well, actually, I'm going to come back to that in just a second, because I do want to say one more thing about support, because you mentioned that earlier. Relationships don't happen in bubbles. We need to be with other people, and you can't develop leadership skills if you're not engaged in communities of some kind. So, ladies and gentlemen, when you're listening to this, I really want you to be thinking about, are you in communities where you are practicing leadership skills? Because all of us are in Facebook groups and in networking groups and so forth, but there's a difference between being in them and practicing showing up in them. Practicing leadership, practicing being the kind of person and the change we want to be. And I'm kind of emphatically ranting about this right now because I've launched the Maturepreneur network, and I really want this to be a community that is different, where we are actively engaged in showing up for one another, where it's really about receiving and giving in very practical ways, that it's where we get to practice being extraordinary rather than ordinary. And so please go and check out maturepreneur.world, because if you want to create extraordinary results, I think we need to be extraordinary people, and we need to practice that. That's what Melissa has been talking about, is the practice of being who we want to be, being the change we want to be in the world. So please go to Maturepreneur World. Become a member of the community so that you can practice. It's incredibly low price, great value, absolutely will support you in stepping into your leadership in whatever is next for you. So thank you. I just wanted to mention that. And whether it's that or something else, like Melissa said earlier, get support. Get support, because when people are outside of us, our stuff's right on the end of our nose. We can't see it. Get a coach, get a mentor, get a counselor, get a group that will be honest with you, whatever it may be, a mastermind group. But get external support. If you want to up-level your game, you can't hang out with the same people you've been hanging out with. Go get people who have that next level in mind, and we'll take you there. We'll support you in being there. So I just wanted to advocate for your, kind of discussion around support. To be better, we need new skills, we need to learn, and we need support with that. So I really appreciate you being one of those people who supports people in developing those skills, because we do need much better leaders. Please, God. So what's one last piece of advice you'd like to leave people with?
I know I already said it once, but the big thing that I keep coming back to is to keep a cool head and a warm heart. It's not enough to get emotionally wound up and invested in everything that's going on around you, but it's also no good to just stay cold and distant. You've got to have both. You've got to have the cognitive and you've got to have the emotional. So put them both together. Keep that cool head and keep a warm heart always.
Beautiful. I'm a big stand for the and, so I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you for being here today, Melissa, and thank you for the work you do in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, reach out to her at eqviaempathy.com and go practice your EQ and your empathy today. Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. I'd love it if you left a comment and subscribed. And I encourage you to apply one aha from this interview right away, so you can turn your wisdom into wealth and your contribution into positive change. Bye for now.